in the biting cold of a detention cell deep within occupied Poland. The year is 1943, and the silence is heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy tread of a German sentry passing in the corridor. Inside the cramped confines of the cell, a British airman sits on a narrow bunk, the damp stone walls pressing in on him. To the casual observer, he appears defeated, a casualty of the air war who has been stripped of his freedom, his aircraft, and his weapon. The iron bars that grid the single, high window seem absolute, a testament to the engineering solidity of the Third Reich's prison system. The war feels impossibly distant, 1,000 miles away across hostile territory. Yet, as the guard's footsteps fade, the airman's demeanor shifts. He reaches down to his heavy flying boots, seemingly to adjust the fit, but his fingers work with a specific, trained purpose. He is holding the key to his salvation, yet it looks like nothing more than a frayed, brown lace. To the guards who have searched him, perhaps multiple times, the laces were invisible, utterly mundane strips of textile essential for keeping boots on feet, unworthy of a second glance. They had checked for knives, for files, for compasses, but they had not checked the laces. They did not know that inside that innocent cotton sheath lay a strand of tempered steel, a flexible surgical wire originally designed to sever human bone, now repurposed to sever the bars of the German war machine. This instrument of escape was not a stroke of luck, nor was it a piece of improvised genius by a desperate soldier. It was the end result of a massive, industrial-scale operation orchestrated from a hotel room in London, the brainchild of a secret department known as MI9. The man in the cell was the beneficiary of a philosophy that viewed escape not as a chaotic scramble for freedom, but as a calculated extension of warfare. The problem that necessitated such ingenuity had arisen 4 years earlier, at the onset of the conflict, presenting a challenge unlike any military planners had faced in history. By 1939, the Royal Air Force was committing to a strategy of strategic bombing that required sending thousands of young men into the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. The attrition rates were terrifying. Records from the Imperial War Museum suggest that nearly half of all operational aircrew in Bomber Command would eventually be killed. But for those who survived the flak and the night fighters, the alternative was often capture. Between the invasion of Poland and the fall of Berlin, over 170,000 Allied servicemen would find themselves behind the barbed wire of the Third Reich. These were not raw recruits. A fully trained bomber pilot represented an investment of roughly £10,000 in 1940s currency, a staggering sum, and possessed skills that took years to hone. Every captured airman was a grounded asset, a total loss to the war effort, unless he could be retrieved. The Germans, efficient and legalistic, had prepared a vast archipelago of prison camps to hold this influx of captives. There were stalags for the enlisted men, offlogs for the officers, and specialized facilities for the aviators who fell from the sky. These camps were built to endure. They adhered to the Geneva Convention, which guaranteed humane treatment, food parcels, and medical care, but international law offered no assistance in the matter of escape. In fact, the camp architecture was a masterclass in containment. Double rows of barbed wire, searchlights that swept the perimeter, machine gun towers, and terrifyingly aggressive dogs. The internal security was equally rigorous, with roll calls, spot searches, and the constant threat of solitary confinement. The traditional tools of a jailbreak, hacksaws, heavy files, wire cutters, were large, metallic, and impossible to hide from a strip search. The Germans knew what a file looked like. They knew what a saw sounded like. To get men out, British intelligence realized they had to reinvent the very concept of an escape tool. They needed devices that could pass through the most paranoid security screenings, objects that were so boring, so ubiquitous, and so innocent that the human eye would simply slide over them. This specific mission fell to MI9, established just before Christmas in 1939. While other intelligence branches like MI5 and MI6 were concerned with counter-espionage and gathering secrets, MI9 had a singular, humanitarian, and strategic directive: facilitate the escape of British prisoners of war and bring them home. The department was commanded by Brigadier Norman Crockett, a veteran of the First World War who operated out of the Metropole Hotel. Crockett was a pragmatist. He understood that a prisoner of war was only useless if he remained in prison. If he could escape, he became a chaotic variable behind enemy lines, tying up police, soldiers, and resources that were desperately needed on the eastern or western fronts. Escape was a form of second front warfare. To lead the technical side of this effort, Crockett did not choose a career engineer or a military tactician. He chose a 46-year-old eccentric named Christopher Clayton Hutton. Hutton was a man of diverse and somewhat bizarre talents, having worked as a journalist and a film publicist. He had no formal experience in military logistics, but he possessed a unique psychological qualification. Decades earlier, in 1913, he had challenged the legendary escape artist Harry Houdini to break out of a packing crate built by Hutton's family timber business. Hutton had built the box to be impregnable. Houdini escaped in minutes by bribing a carpenter to rig the box. The lesson defined Hutton's life. Brute strength is inferior to deception. The best way to escape is to cheat. When Hutton joined MI9, his mandate was to turn this philosophy into hardware. He looked at the equipment a soldier carried: his uniform, his buttons, his boots, his grooming kit, and saw blank canvases for concealment. He realized that the German guards were looking for weapons and tools, so he had to give them objects that appeared to be neither. His greatest triumph in the realm of cutting tools began with a chance conversation about surgery. He learned of a device invented in the 1890s by an Italian obstetrician named Leonardo Gili. The Gili saw was a flexible wire used to cut through pelvic bone during difficult births. It was a marvel of simple engineering: 2 or more strands of high-tensile steel wire twisted together in a helix. The twisting created a serrated surface along the entire length of the wire, essentially a flexible file with teeth on all sides. It could be coiled up into a circle no larger than a coin. Hutton realized immediately that if this wire could cut through a femur, it could cut through a window bar. The adaptation of the Geely saw for military use was a feat of industrial camouflage. Hutton sourced the raw serrated wire from producers in Birmingham and then had it sheathed in a cotton or rayon braiding. To the naked eye and the touch, it was a shoelace. It bent like a shoelace, tied like a shoelace, and threaded through the eyelets of a standard issue 1943 flying boot perfectly. The only difference was that this lace could not be snapped. At the ends of the lace, hidden connectors were fitted that allowed the user to attach simple handles, often improvised from other bits of kit or simply loops of fabric. Mi-9 began production on a massive scale. Records indicate that enough wire was procured to manufacture 10,000 of these escape laces. They were issued to aircrews before missions, laced directly into their boots. A pilot could be shot down, parachute into a field, be captured by the Wehrmacht, stripped of his pistol, his radio, and his flight jacket, and then marched into a high-security prison camp while wearing the very tool he would use to break out. The physics of using the lace saw required a specific technique, one that demanded the patience of a saint. Unlike a rigid hacksaw which allows a user to apply significant downward pressure, the wire saw worked through friction and abrasion. The prisoner had to loop the wire behind the bar, grip the ends, and pull back and forth in a steady rhythm. It was a slow, grueling process. The friction generated intense heat, which could weaken the wire or cause it to snap if the user went too fast. The prisoner had to stop frequently to let the metal cool. To dampen the distinctive rasping sound of metal biting into metal, a noise that would instantly alert a guard, prisoners would wrap wet rags around the bar or wait for the clamor of a passing train or a thunderstorm. It might take hours to cut a single bar, or perhaps several nights of clandestine labor. But against the mild iron and steel typically used in prison construction, the Geely saw was devastating. It turned the prisoner's cell from a cage into a workshop, but the lace saw was merely one component of a much larger ecosystem of escape designed by Hutton. The boots themselves were often marvels of engineering. The 1943 pattern escape boot addressed a critical problem. Flying boots were bulky, fleece-lined, and conspicuous. A man walking through the French countryside in sheepskin aviator boots was immediately identifiable as a downed pilot. Hutton designed a boot with a perforated upper section. With a sharp knife, often concealed in a hidden pocket within the boot itself, the aviator could slice away the top part of the boot, leaving behind a discreet black leather Oxford shoe that looked like civilian footwear. The hollow heel of the boot could be pried open to reveal a silk map of the area, a tiny compass, and sometimes a file or German currency. It was a complete survival kit worn on the feet. The detached fleece upper could even be sewn together with others to create a warm waistcoat for the winter trek. Getting these devices to the men who had already been captured required a distribution network as creative as the inventions themselves. Mi-9 faced a delicate diplomatic hurdle. They could not smuggle contraband in Red Cross parcels. The Red Cross packages were the lifeline of the POWs, providing food and tobacco. If the Germans found a wire saw in a Red Cross box, they would halt all shipments, and men would starve. Mi-9 had to create its own supply chain. They invented fictional charitable organizations with innocuous names like the Licensed Victuallers Sports Association, the Prisoners' Leisure Hours Fund, and the Ladies' Knitting Circle. These phantom charities, complete with letterheads and return addresses in bombed-out sections of London to prevent verification, sent thousands of comfort parcels to the camps. Inside these parcels were games and pastimes that disguised the escape aids. Hutton partnered with major British manufacturers who were brought in on the secret. John Waddington Ltd., the company that held the license for Monopoly in the UK, produced special sets for prisoners. The game boards were laminated with maps concealed between the cardboard layers. The playing pieces were made of real metal files. The play money included genuine German Reichsmarks, French francs, and Italian lira. Compass points were hidden in pen nibs. Geely saws were coiled inside the hollow cores of dartboards or embedded in the handles of cricket bats. Even gramophone records were utilized, with maps pressed between the layers of shellac, accessible only by smashing the record. Between 1942 and 1945, nearly 7,000 of these rig parcels were dispatched. A simple code on the exterior of the box, such as "Patent Applied For," signaled to the designated escape officer in the camp that this was not an ordinary game of Monopoly, but a crate of contraband. The secrecy surrounding these operations was so intense that Mi-9 destroyed the vast majority of its records at the end of the war. They feared that revealing their methods would compromise future escape attempts in future wars. Consequently, specific documented instances of the boot lace saw in action are rare, existing mostly in the oral histories of veterans and the few surviving memoirs. However, we know of Lieutenant David Bowling, held at Stalag Luft III, the site of the famous Great Escape. In late 1943, facing rumors that the SS was taking control of the camps and planning mass executions, Bowling used a kit that included a Geely saw and wire cutters, likely smuggled in through the game parcel route, to breach the perimeter. He successfully traveled hundreds of miles to Zurich, Switzerland, carrying vital intelligence. At Colditz Castle, the high-security fortress for incorrigible escapers, the sheer volume of Mi-9 contraband was staggering. Records suggest that over 300 escape attempts were launched from Colditz, many fueled by the maps, money, and tools provided by Hutton's department. 32 men made it all the way home from that stone fortress, a testament to the effectiveness of the tools provided. Of course, the Germans were not incompetent. The cat-and-mouse game escalated throughout the war. Initially, the German guards treated the care packages with casual indifference, checking only for large weapons. But as escape attempts multiplied and traces of contraband were found, their scrutiny tightened. They began to X-ray parcels, which could reveal the metal density of a hidden compass or a wire saw. They started breaking open walnuts to look for micromaps and dissolving game boards in water to see if paper separated. They even eventually realized the bootlace trick. By late 1944, the influx of successful contraband had slowed, but the damage was already done. Thousands of maps and tools were already inside the wire. The Germans were forced to divert immense manpower to searching parcels and patrolling perimeters, resources that were stripped away from the crumbling front lines. What makes the MI9 story truly remarkable is the lack of reciprocity. There was no German equivalent to Christopher Clayton Hutton. Research into Axis prisoner policies reveals a stark difference in philosophy. The Germans did not have a strategic bomber force that operated deep in enemy territory for long durations. Their pilots flew tactical support and, if shot down, were usually close to their own lines. Furthermore, the German military ethos did not emphasize escape as a formalized duty in the same way the British did. When German pilots were captured in Britain or Canada, their escape attempts relied on individual ingenuity, making compasses from magnetized needles and cork or carving fake stamps from potatoes. They did not have a centralized bureaucracy in Berlin manufacturing millions of fake bootlaces or hollow monopoly boards. The Americans, however, recognized the brilliance of the British system immediately. When the US entered the war, they set up MI6, a mirror organization that was explicitly modeled on MI9 and relied heavily on British manufacturing. American airmen flew into battle wearing British boots laced with British wire saws. The legacy of this ingenuity extends directly to the present day. The principles of SEER, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, training used by NATO forces are the direct descendants of Hutton's curriculum. The concept that a soldier is never truly unarmed as long as he has his wits and a few hidden tools remains central to Special Forces doctrine. The wire saw itself has barely changed. The modern BCB Commando wire saw, standard issue to the British SAS and survival kits worldwide, is functionally identical to the device Hutton adapted from Leonardo Gilli's surgical tool. The idea that the most mundane object can be a weapon or a key is now a staple of military tradecraft. Christopher Clayton Hutton died in 1965, largely uncelebrated by the public due to the classified nature of his work. He had fought a war not with artillery or tanks, but with deception. He had understood that the German mind revered order and routine, and he used that against them. He turned the very objects of their imprisonment, the games they allowed, the clothes they inspected, into the instruments of their defeat. In that cold cell in Poland, as the airmen slowly worked the wire back and forth, feeling the bite of the steel into the iron bar, he was participating in a victory of imagination. The Germans had built walls, towers, and guns. They had constructed a system designed to be inescapable. But they had failed to account for the eccentric brilliance of a film publicist who remembered a magic trick from 1913. They saw a prisoner tying his shoes. MI9 saw a soldier cutting his way home.